ReactJS is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. It was developed by Facebook and it is now maintained by a community of developers. Today, in this session, we will learn about ReactJS Hooks, which is the more important core concept in ReactJS. Hi, I am 𝐑𝐤𝐿𝐿 from Edureka and I welcome you all to this session on ReactJS Hooks tutorial, where we will understand all about ReactJS Hooks. So without any delay, let us go through the agenda. First, we will look into what is hooks in ReactJS and why do we use hooks in ReactJS. Followed by, we will see the types of React hooks in this session and we will look into the demo simultaneously. But before we get started with today's session, you make sure that you subscribe to our Edureka YouTube channel and hit the bell icon to stay updated with all the latest trending technologies. And also, if you are interested in ReactJS certification training, then please click on the link given in the description box. Now let us go and explore all about ReactJS hooks, starting from what is ReactJS hooks. ReactJS hooks are functions that allow you to use the state and other React features in functional components. They were actually introduced in React 16.8 as a way to make it easier to share the stateful logic between the components, and also to make it easier to work with the functional components. Here, the most commonly used hooks are the useState, useEffect, and useContext. So these are considered more important or most useful hooks. So other than this, we will also explore some of the additional hooks too. For example, useReducer, useMemo, useCallback, and useLayoutEffect. So these are the hooks that we will be exploring in this session. We will see each of it in a detailed form right now. Before that, we will see what actually the hooks are. Now let us go back and see before React hooks. So before React hooks, if you wanted to use the state or other features in the component, then you had to use a class component. Here the class component are more complex than the functional components and can make it difficult to reuse the stateful logic. Here with the React hook, you can use the state and other features in the functional component, which makes it easier to share the stateful logic between the components. And also it makes it easier to work with the functional components. Here the React hooks differ from the traditional React class component because in that they allow you to use the state and other features in the functional components instead of having to use the class components. And additionally, you must keep this in mind. Here the React hooks do not require the use of this keyword, which makes them less verbose and easier to understand. And why do we say here the class component is more difficult? So here the class component in React are based on this JavaScript class syntax, which can make them difficult to understand for the developers who are new to the React or who are more familiar with the functional programming. Additionally, these class components often include the boilerplate code, such as the constructor, functions, and binding the methods to the correct context, which can add unnecessary complexity and make the code harder to maintain. And the most important feature of this React hook is it allows the creation of custom hooks, which are reusable functions that can hold the state or the logic that can be shared between the multiple components. Here, this makes it easy to extract and reuse the logic that is used in the multiple components. So at the end, this can make the code base more maintainable and easier to understand. One of the main advantages of React hook is that they make it easier to share the stateful logic between the components, as I said in the previous statement. So this is because the state and the logic can be extracted into a single hook and it can be reused in multiple components, rather than having to duplicate the logic in multiple class components. React hook also make it easier to test the functional components since they do not rely on this keyword and the lifecycle methods. Now let us see the types of hooks we have in this session. Here we have three major hooks, that is useState, useEffect, and useContext. So these are considered to be basic hooks and more important hooks or commonly used hooks. And additionally, we will also look into useReducer, useMemo, useCallback, and finally useLayoutEffect. So these are the hooks which we will be covering in this session. Other than this, we also have many other hooks. So if you want to learn more about hooks or more about ReactJS, you can enroll to our Edureka's ReactJS certification training course, where we will be providing you with an hands-on and live demo sessions. So here, we will get started with our first hook, that is useState. So let us see what is useState and how does it work in our code, and I will give some of the tips that how can you use the useState inside the code. Now, according to the definition, useState is a hook in React that allows you to add the state to the functional component. State is a way of storing and managing the data that can change over time and can affect the component's behavior and rendering. Though I will explain it in a detailed form. Here, this useState is a hook in React that allows you to manage the state in the functional component. Prior to the introduction of hooks, the state management in React was only possible in class-based components. So, with this use of useState, you can now manage the state in the functional component as well. And also, the useState is a function that takes a single argument, so which is the initial state. After that, it returns an array with two elements, that is, current state and a setter function for updating the state. The current state is a value of the state and the setter function is used to update the state. So here I will explain this in a detailed form with an example. So I am using Visual Studio Code. So here I will show you a small demo. For that, I will jump into Visual Studio Code. Now, as you can see, I have already created an app called Counter app. So you can see here the Counter app, and here I have created a counter.jsx inside the source folder and inside the components folder. Now let us write a small React hook example. First, I will import the React component from React. For that, just import React from React. Okay. After that, I will import useState hook from the React package after this line. For that, you just need to write import in the bracket useState. So you will have some of the recommendations over here, and you need to find useState over here. So state. And you can notice that I am writing in a camel case statement. Here, the ReactJS takes the import in a camel case. After this, now that we have imported the component and useState from React, at the same time, we need to export this file to the index.js, right? So that the output will be shown in the browser. So that don't forget to export this file to the index.js. So I will export. So just type export default counter, because my file name is counter. So I'm writing counter. And you just need to go inside the index.js and include the counter file inside the React strict node. Now let us get back to the counter.js file. So now let us declare a new state variable. So let us call this as count. Here the useState returns a pair of value, that is the current state and the function that updates it, as I said in the explanation. So that we will just write a function called counter. Inside that, just write const and pass the values, that is the current state and the function that updates it, right? So here the current state is this count, and then we will set the count. So this will be the function that updates it. And in our component, we use the useState hook by invoking it and passing the initial value for our state variable, which is 0. So I'll use that. So I'm using the useState. So I'm passing the value as 0. Okay. Now let us return this. So I'm wrapping this with a div tag. Now here we use the count variable to display the current number of clicks in the page. And in the button tag, Here we use this onClick property to specify a function that will be called when the button is clicked, right? Now for that I will write a paragraph to indicate the numbers. So I'm writing you clicked. Here I'm calling the count, and this count will be indicated in numbers. So you have clicked this many times. So right? So I will give the button to click. So on click. So I'm calling this set function. So that is set count. This s should be in a small. Here the function that we pass to on click is an arrow function that calls the set count and passes in the new value of the count. So which is the current value plus 1. So let us write the count, that is the current value, and plus 1. So whenever the button is clicked, here the count will be incremented like the current value plus 1. So the count will be incremented to 1. So I'll close the button by telling click. Okay. So let us run this by typing npm start, and you can see the server has started. You can see that we have written you clicked this many times, right? So let us click this button and check. So here you can see the number is incrementing. So if I click on this, the number is changed the value to 2. So that the current value is right now is 2. So if I click the button once again, the number will be incremented plus 1. So that the current value plus 1 will be incremented. So here as you can see, the count, this is the current value and plus 1. So every time the button is clicked, this function will be called and the state variable count will be updated. And here the component will be re-rendered to reflect the new value. So I hope you understood. Now I will give you some of the tips to use the useState. Here we have some of the limitations. For example, keep state update simple. Here you need to avoid the complex logics or the calculations when updating the state. Instead, use a callback function to update the state based on its current value. And next, so you need to keep in mind that you need to use the useState when it is only necessary. Here, use props or the context when possible, instead of creating the state for every piece of data. After that, you need to use the useEffect hook for the side effects. Keep the state top level. That means you need to keep the state at the top level of your component hierarchy, as opposed to buried deeply in class component. This makes it easier to understand and debug the code easier. And you need to keep in mind that you need to test your components. Always you need to test your component to make sure that they work correctly and the state updates are behaving as expected. With that, we will move on to the next hook, that is useEffect. Now let us explore about useEffect. Here, this useEffect is a hook in React that allows you to synchronize a components with an external system. Also, it will allow you to tell that React to run a piece of code after rendering in order to update the system or the side effects of the component. So this is done by specifying a callback function that contains the code to run and an array of dependencies, which are variables that components uses and that React will watch for changes. Now, when the component is first rendered, the callback function passes to the useEffect will be run. This is similar to the component did mount lifecycle method in the class component. If any of the dependencies specified in the dependency array change, React will rerun the effect. Now, this is also similar to the component did update lifecycle method in the class component. So as I said before, here we have class did mount, class did update, and class did unmount. So these lifecycle methods are used in the class component. So here the next lifecycle I'll be explaining is component will unmount. Here, when the component is unmount, the cleanup function passes to the useEffect when it will be run. This is for cancelling network requests or cleaning up any other side effects that were created. Now that we will understand this useEffect hook with a small example. So I'll go back to the Visual Studio Code. I will clean up the useState. I will keep the React component and the export as default. Now, we need to use the useState and useEffect from the React. So for that, we will import useEffect along with the useState from the React package after the React component line. So that I will just import inside the curly braces, write useEffect and useState. Right? In our component, we declare a state variable data using this useState. And the initial value is an empty array. So for that, we will just write a function for that. Counter. So for that, I will be setting the constant values here. And I'll pass both width and the set width. As I said, the current value and the function that will be updated. So here width is the current value and I'll set the state So now what does this line mean? So here I have written this line, right? Now this means that I am taking the Windows inner width. So let us see. For example, I want the inner width of the browser and I need to design a web page where my grid needs to match it. So I need to know the width of my system or the browser. So that I am taking the inner width of the browser. Now let us fetch the useEffect. I am taking the function handle resize. So we need to know the size of our window, right? So that is why we are using this function handle. Now I will set the width for window inner width. Here, the setWidth function updates the state when the browser window is resized. Now, let us set the window event listener. Here, the useEffect hook is used to add an event listener to the window that listens for a resize event. And when the resize event is triggered, the handle resize function is called. For that, we are writing a code here. So for that, window dot add event listener. And I am specifying here resize. Here, as I said, when the resize is triggered, the handle resize will be called to update the width of the state in the new value of the Windows inner width. Now here let us clean up the function to remove the event listener. Here now I will return the remove event listener. Here I am specifying this window dot remove event listener. Here the empty array at the end of the useEffect is the dependencies. It means this effect only runs once on the component mount, right? So here now I will return this also. So I'm writing the Windows width will be. So I'm calling this width function here. Here the component returns a div that displays the current width of the browser. right? Now let us check out the results. Here, the window width is 614. Now let us resize this. Here, as you can see, if I resize, the window's width changed to 335. So if I again resize, so it will change according to that. So it will not change the height. So as if we have just said only for the width. The total window width of my system is 614. So if I resize, so it will change according to the size we moved to. So I hope you understood the example with the useEffect. Here some of the tips to practice this use case in a best way. For that, you need to first understand the purpose of the use case of the useEffect hook. Here it is used to handle the side effects. So as I said in the example, such as the data fetching in a functional component. And always you need to include a dependency array as the second argument to the useEffect. And this array should include any variables or state that the effect depends on. Here, if a variable is not included in the dependency array, that the effect will run on every render. And you should be mindful of the order in which effect runs. Here, these effects are executed in the order that they defined. So, it is important to consider that the order of your effects if they are dependent on each other. And you should use the cleanup function provided by the useEffect to remove any side effects before the component is unmount. So this is especially important for the data fetching and subscriptions to prevent the memory leaks. So as I did here in the example, I did the cleanup function to remove the event listener, right? So like that. And also you should keep in mind that the excessive use of useEffect can lead to unnecessary re-renders and it can be slow down your applications. And also you can use the useContext hook instead of useEffect when possible. Here the useContext is a simpler and more efficient way to manage the shared state across the multiple components. That is what we are looking next. We will look into the useContext here. Now let us see what is useContext. It is a kind of hook that is used to consume the context in a functional component. It is an alternate to the context type property or the consumer component that were used in the class component. Here, when a component needs to access the context, it can use the useContext hook to describe to the context and retrieve its current value. The hook takes the context object as its argument and returns the current value of the context. The component can then use this value to update its state or props. The useContext hook allows a component to subscribe to changes in context so that it can re-render when the context value changes. So this is done without the need to pass props down manually through every level of the component tree, which makes the code more efficient and maintainable. Here, when a context value changes, the React will re-render all the components that are using that context. This means that the component using useContext hook will be re-rendered too, which is how the component will get updated with the new context value. Now if I summarize the useContext, the useContext hooks allows the functional component to access the context and the subscribe to changes in context. It also eliminates the need to pass the property through the multiple levels of the component tree, eventually which leads to more efficient and maintainable code. Now let us see a small example. So let us go to Visual Studio Code and I will just remove from the function. So default, let us keep import React component from React. Here in import, we will just import the create context with useContext. Okay. So now let us create a context with a default value. For that, I am writing the const and theme context. Here we use this create context to create a new context called this theme context. Okay, with the default value of light. So I'll keep the default value as light, which is equal to create context to light, right? Fine. Now let us create a function counter. Now let us use the context to access the current theme, right? So that I am specifying the const. Now the theme is, we are using the use context in theme context. Here in our example component, we use the useContext hook to access the current value of the theme context, right? So here we have light. So we need to access this light in this theme context. Here we will return the div. So let us specify the class name as theme, right? And let me write something like the current. So we need to get the output from this theme. So when the value changes here, the value here will be also changed accordingly. Now here let me write a function called app and return the theme context dot provider value is dark. So I am specifying the counter over here inside the theme context. Right, now let us see the output. Here, as you can see, the current theme is light, right? We access the value of the context in this case. Here the theme, and we use it to set the class name of the div element. And in the app component, we wrap the element component with the theme context provider and set the value to the dark. Okay. Here now, whether the value is provided to the context will be available to all the components that are wrapped inside the theme context provider, and all of them will be able to access the current value of the context by calling the use context and theme context. Okay. Now here some of the tips to practice the use context. Here, to keep the context value minimal, only store the values that are necessary for the components that are consuming the context. And you need to avoid the storing unnecessary data, as it can lead to unnecessary re-renders and performance issue. And also you need to use the default values. Always provide the default values for the context when creating it, in case that consuming the component does not have access to the context. Now you should use the use context for global state so that it is shared across the multiple components, such as the user's authenticated status or the selected theme. Also, you need to avoid using context for local state. Here, use state hooks for local state that is specific to single component rather than using the context. Only update context when necessary. You should only update the context when the value has changed to avoid the unnecessary re-renders and performance issues. Here you need to use the useEffect hook to update the context. The next we have the test context. Test the context value and update to ensure that they are working correctly. Here we use the test context to test the value that were updated correctly and whether it is working correctly. Now then we have the use multiple context. So here if you have multiple pieces of global state and that need to be shared, here we need to consider using the multiple context to keep the state organized and easy to manage. With that, we will move on to useReducer hook. Here, the useReducer is a hook in React that allows for managing the state within a functional component. Here, it is similar to useState, but it is typically used for more complex state management. And the state reducer hook takes two arguments, a reducer function and an initial state. Here, the reducer function is a pure function that takes the current state and an action, and it returns the next state. The initial state is the starting state of the component state. A component can call the dispatch function returned by the useReducer to send an action to the reducer. Here, the reducer that updates the state based on the action and the current state, and also the component re-renders with the new state. The useReducer is considered more powerful than useState because it allows for more complex state management, such as handling the asynchronous actions and managing the multiple pieces of state at once. In short, the useReducer is a hook that allows you to manage the state within a functional component in a way that it is similar to how you would manage the state in a Redux store. It takes two arguments, a reducer function and an initial state, as I said initially, and returns the current state and a dispatch function that can be used to update the state. Now with that, let us look into a small example. So let me remove from the import again. Let us import the useReducer package from React. After that, we create a reducer function that takes in two arguments, that is state and action. Here, which are the current state and the action that is being dispatched respectively. Okay, so that let's write const. So initially I'm setting the value to count 0. So initial state is count 0. Fine. After that, the function reducer state action. After that, I have switch case. In that, I will write switch. I'll write action type. If that is the case, then the case should be in increment. Then I will return the count to the state count plus 1. If the case is in the decrement, then I will return count state minus 1. Then default, I will return the state. First, let me write the code, and I will be explaining you each and every statement here, right? So that first here I'll write the function. Here, as you know, the useReducer hook returns a pair of values, the current state and a function that updates it. In our case, we use the destructuring assignment to assign the state and dispatch, right? Here, we use the state count to display the current count in the page and in the button tag. Here, for that, I will specify the page and the button tag. Here, for that, I am returning a statement. So, return. Here, I am writing the count. Here, count and the state count. Now, let us specify the button for increment as well as the decrement. Here, on click, let us write the dispatch. So this type will be in increment. Fine. Now for the same, I will give for decrement. Right, see here. Here I am giving the decrement. So after that, the div is closed. So here the function that passes in the onClick property to specify a function that will be called when the button is clicked. So I'll be showing that in the output page. Here the function that we have passed to onClick is an arrow. That function calls dispatch and it passes in the object that describes the action that should be performed. Here in this case, the action type is either increment or decrement, right? So when the component is rendered, it was initially the number is 0. The count is 0. So when the button is clicked in the increment, so it will call the dispatch function with the type increment. And the reducer function will receive the action and the state so that it will update the state and increment by 1. So see, for example, if I go to the output, so if the button is clicked in the increment, so the count will be 2. For example, if I increment 1, so the count will be plus 1, right? So when the minus button or the decrement button is clicked, so it will call the dispatch function to the decrement. Then the reducer function will receive the action and the state. So it will update the state and decrease by the count 1. And the component will re-render and it will show us the output as minus 1. So count minus 1. So here keep your state and the action simple. Now let me give you some of the tips. Here you need to keep your state and action simple. The useReducer is designed to handle the complex state and actions, but it is important to keep them as simple as possible to avoid the confusions and make it easier to debug. And also you should use the initial state correctly. Make sure to provide an initial state that is the same type and shape as the state in your reducer function. And the use actions to change the state. You need to use the actions to change the state in your reducer. So do not modify the state directly as this can lead to unexpected behavior. Also, you need to keep your reducer function pure. So what that your reducer function should be pure means it should not have any side effects and should not rely on any external state or variables. So with that, we will move on to the useMemo. useMemo is a hook that allows you to optimize the performance of your React component by only recalculating a value when one of its dependencies has changed. Now, it is similar to the useEffect hook in that it allows you to perform a side effect, but instead of updating the component state or props, it returns a value that can be used by the component. Here, the useMemo hook takes two arguments as previous hooks takes. The first one is a function that returns the value you want to store, and the second one is an array of dependencies. The function is only called when one of the dependencies has changed. If none of the dependencies have changed, the previous value is returned instead of recalculating the value. For example, if you have a component that displays a list of items and the list is passed in as a prop, you can use the useMemo to only refilter the list when the search item changes, instead of refiltering the list on every render. Now let us see a small example. So now let us go to Visual Studio Code. I just have import React component from React and I have exported the counter. Now let me import the hooks from the React. So I'm importing useState and useMemo, right? Now let us define a functional component called counter. Okay, so function counter. Now let us create the state variable for first name, last name, and age. So that constant first is our first name. Then I will set the first name. Here I will use the useState. Same thing for last name and age. I am giving a empty parameter over here so that it is dynamically updated when the user enters the first name, last name, and the age. Okay, right. Now let us calculate the user object over here. So now let us see. This function will rerun only if the first name, last name, or the age state variable have changed. So I am giving the user also. So const user by using the useMemo. So let us return the full name, the full name consists of the first name and the last name. And finally age, right? In the array, I'm just giving the first name, last name, and age. Return inside the div, I'm just giving the input value for the first name, last name, and the age. Here the component also uses the useMemo here, right? So this hook can create a memorized object called the user. So that is why we have specified the user over here. And that combines the first name, last name, and the age, the state variable, into a single object with properties, that is first name and the age. The components then renders input field that allows the user to update the state variables and display the user object. So that is what. So here I will be giving the input values over here. Here first one is the first name. On change, so if the value is changed, then the output should be re-rendered. Here in the age, we have to type the number. So the input value will be in the form of number, right? Then let me give a paragraph inside saying the full name and the age. Now let us see the output. So if I show you the output, here I can type my name. So here in the full name, you will get the first name and this is the last name. So for example, I'll type V. So as you can see, the full name I have written in the first name as Tejaswini and the last name has V. So in the code here, it should return in the name of full name is the first name plus the last name and the age, right? So here if you see, in the place of first name, I have typed only my first name, and in the last name and in the place of age, since I given in the input has numbers, so it will tell you to increment or decrement, or else you can even type the number. So in place of age, you have the number over here, right? For example, 46. Yeah. And you can increment or decrement as you need. So in this code, The React functional component is called the counter, right? So it uses the React hook called useState and useMemo to manage and update the component state and to perform a calculation based on the state. Here, the component has three state variables, that is the first name, last name, and age. So, which are initialized using the useState. Now, these state variables are used to control the values of three input fields rendered in the component JSX, that is, these three input fields. Here, the component also has a user variable. So, here you can see the user variable, right? Here, the function concatenates the first name and the last name, the state variable, to create the full name, the property of the user object, and the user age, that state variable as the state property. The second argument of the useMemo is array of dependencies, which is used to determine when the calculation should be rerun. In this case, the calculation will rerun only if the first name, last name, or age state variable has changed. The component re-renders an input field from each state variable and displays the full name and age property of the user object. Right, with that, we will move on to the tips for useMemo. Use the hook called useMemo when you need to compute a value that depends on prop or state but not change often. Always pass a function that runs the value you want to memorize as the first argument. The function should take the props or state that the value depends on an argument, and the useMemo with the second argument an array of dependencies to tell the React which values the memorized value depends on. So this will ensure that the memorized value is only recalculated when one of the dependency changes. Avoid using useMemo in render functions, as it can lead to poor performances. Instead, you can use it in the component functions that are called before the component re-renders. Also, you need to use the useMemo with the caution when working with the large data set or the complex computations, as it can cause performance issues if not used correctly. And avoid using the useMemo to store functions, as they cannot memorize. Instead, you can use the useCallback hook for this purpose. Now, let us see useCallback hook. useCallback is nothing but it is also a React hook that allows you to optimize the performance of your React component by only recreating a callback function when one of its dependencies has changed. It is similar to useMemo, but that allows you to store a value and only update it when the dependencies has changed. But instead of storing a computed value, it stores a callback function. Here, the callback hook takes two arguments. The first one is a callback function that you want to store, and the second is an array of dependencies. Here, the function is only recreated when one of the dependencies has changed. If none of the dependency have changed, the previous callback is returned instead of creating a new one. For example, if you have a component that displays a list of items and the list is passed in as a prop, you can use the use callback to only recreate the function that handles the recreating the function on every render. But it is important to note that the use callback is often used in the conjunction with the useMemo when the dependencies are object or the function. To prevent unnecessary re-renders and recalculations, as useMemo only recalculates the value when the reference to the object or functions changes. Now let us see a small example for use callback hook and import the hook packages from React. That is, I'm using the useState and useCallback from React. Now the function called counter. let us initialize the count and the increment value here, right? So that for here I am writing the const. So I'm setting the count as well by use keys, by useState. And the next one is increment. I'm using the useCallback function over here. Let's set the count to count +1 because we are incrementing it, right? So, right. Now let us return with a div tag. Inside that I'm writing a h1 tag. So I'm telling the count value. Then I'm specifying the child increment. After this, we have the child increment over here, as you can see, right? So that I'm creating a function over here called child. Inside that, I'm just passing an argument called increment by returning a button with an onClick function increment. Right? Now, in this example, the parent component has a state variable that is count. So as you can see here, we have count. This is the parent component. And the callback function is the increment. That increments by 1. So here the count plus 1. So as you can see, this is the parent component plus incrementing by 1. Here the child component receives the increment function as a prop and renders a button when clicked. And it calls the increment function over here. The useCallback hook is used to memorize the increment function, passing in the count as a dependency. This means that the increment function will only be recreated if the count state variables change. So this can help to prevent the unnecessary re-renders of the child components. When you run the code, the output will be an increment button and a h1 tag saying the count is 0. So when you click on the button, the count will be increasing by 1 and the h1 tag will be displaying the updated count, right? So if you can see, I'm clicking on increment and the number changes to 2 by increment plus 1. So 1 plus 1 is 2. Okay. So right, now let us see some of the tips. So here, use the useCallback when you need to pass a callback function as a prop to a child component and you want to avoid the unnecessary re-renders. Always, you need to provide the dependency array as the second argument to use the callback. This tells the React which variables the callback depends on and when it should recreate the callback. And also you need to keep in mind that the dependencies you include in the array, if you include too much or unnecessary dependencies, it can cause the unnecessary re-renders and negatively impact performance. And you need to avoid the use callback inside the loops or conditions, as it can lead to unexpected behavior and hard to debug the issues. And always you need to check if the callback function is the same using the reference equality operator before passing it to a prop. So this will prevent the unnecessary re-renders of the parent component. You need to be careful while using the use callback function. With this, the state or prop that are objects or array, because these are passed by references, not by values. So if the callback depends on such variables, it will be recreated every time the parent component re-renders. And you need to be aware that the use callback does not work with async functions. because it cannot memorize the results of asynchronized operations. Always test your component with and without useCallback to check that if it works as expected and that the performance improves you expect as visible, right? Okay, now let's move on to the last hook in this session, that is useLayoutEffect. Now, what is useLayoutEffect? useLayoutEffect is a React hook that allows you to synchronize all layout changes to a component. Here it is similar to the useEffect, but it runs synchronously after all DOM mutations. Now, this can be useful when you need to measure a DOM node or read its layout before making changes that affects its size or position. Also, it should be used with caution as it can cause visual inconsistencies if not used correctly. And also, it is recommended to use useEffect unless you have a specific use case that requires the synchronous behavior of useLayoutEffect. So you need to be careful while using the useLayoutEffect. And also importantly to note that the useLayoutEffect should be used only for updates that are critical to the visual appearances of the component and that cannot wait until the next frame. For all other updates, it is generally recommended to use the useEffect instead with the run asynchronously and does not block the main thread. And also it is important to remember that if you need to perform any side effects that involves the DOM, such as adding or removing the event listeners, you should do so inside the useLayoutEffect instead of useEffect. This is because the useEffect runs after the browser has painted and may cause unnecessary layout thrashing if it updates the layout of your component. Okay, with that, let us move on to the example. Now, this code is a simple React functional component that uses the useLayoutEffect and the useState. So here it uses these both hooks to measure the width of an element and display it in the screen. Okay, the first code imports that the layout effect and the useState and the useRef from the React library, right? Here the useState is a hook that allows you to add the state to a functional component. In this case, it is being used to create a state variable called width and that will store the width of the element. Here the useState hook also returns a set width. So that can be used to update the value of the width state variable. Here now the useRef is a hook that allows you to create a reference to a DOM node. So in this case, it is being used to create a reference to a div element that will be used to measure the width of the element over here. Here, the useLayoutEffect is a hook that allows you to synchronize and apply the layout changes to the component. So it is similar to the useEffect as I mentioned earlier, but it runs synchronized after all DOM mutations. So this can be useful when you need to measure a DOM node or read its layout before making changes that affects its size or the position. So this component start with the div element with the id myElement and within the width state variable is displayed. And useLayoutEffect is then invoked. So inside the hook, the code first gets a reference to the element with the id called myElement using the document.getElementById inside the myId. This useLayoutEffect hook is then invoked. Inside the hook, the code first gets a reference to the element using the ref variable called ref.current. You can see here this ref.current. Then it uses the getBoundingClientRange, right? This method to measure that the width of the element and assign it to the variable width. After that, the setWidth function is invoked with the width variable as an argument, so which updates the state variable with the width of the element. Here, the useLayoutEffect hook also accepts a cleanup function, which is a function that runs when the component is unmounted or the effect is being rerun. So this is that function. Okay. So the cleanup function will also display the cleanup in console. So when you inspect in the console, then you will get to know about it, right? And also you need to keep in mind that it is important to note that the useLayoutEffect hook should be used with the 𝐂𝐝𝐿 as I mentioned. So as it can cause the visual inconsistencies if not used correctly. So it is recommended to you to use the useEffect unless you have a specific use case that requires the synchronized behavior of the useLayoutEffect. And it is important that if you don't provide a dependency array, the effect will run on every render, so which could lead to a performance issue. So it is better to provide a dependency array with the values that the effect rely on, so that it only runs when those values changes. Okay, so it should not run whenever the small changes happens, the whole program will run. So write in this example an empty dependency array. So this is the empty dependency array. So it is passed to a useLayoutEffect hook. So which means that it will only run the code once when the component is first rendered. So in this example, instead of using the document.getElement by ID to find the element, it is passed to a reference to the element as it uses the ref.current. Here, the ref.current.getBoundingClientRect. So to get the width of the element, so let us see the output over here. So we have to run. So after that, so as you can see, the width of the element is around 613.4400. Okay. So let us inspect this. Here you can see, as I mentioned, you will get a console. Here we have console, right? As you can see here, the cleaning up function, as I said in the program, right? Here you will get the cleanup function here. So inside the console, you will get the cleaning up. And that is it for the session on ReactJS Hooks tutorial. And if you have any doubts about this topic, then quickly head over to the comment section and post your questions over there. We will get back to you as soon as possible. And also we have lot more videos coming on this topic, and not only on this topic, we have many other technologies too. So you make sure you subscribe to our Edureka channel and get notified by clicking on the bell icon so that you can make most out of it. So let's see you in the next session. Until then, happy learning, guys.
I hope you have enjoyed listening to this video. Please be kind enough to like it, and you can comment any of your doubts and queries, and we will reply them at the earliest. Do look out for more videos in our playlist and subscribe to Edureka channel to learn more. Happy learning!